Okay, it's recording.
Okay, so what future did Himmler envision for Germany and its new eastern territories, Poland, USSR, once the war is over?
I can start. I said, like my view on the text was I felt Himmler envisioned a future for Germany and the new Eastern territories where they would be more like colonized and used as sources almost for like materials and labor for like the benefit of the people of Germany, and that he um believed more in like the absolute rule for the I think it was like the SS men to be like honest, loyal, and like comradely to members. I think I have a quote from it that I felt was like a good reasoning, but I had Himmler stated, "What happens to the Russian does not interest me in the slightest, whether nations live in prosperity or starve to death. Interest me only insofar we need them for the slaves of our culture, I think, or culture. Otherwise, it is of no interest to me," which I think was page one. And I also, adding into that was, I also feel like he believed in like indoctrinating German boys with the laws of like the SS organization and like drafting age groups through the laws. And I think another quote I had for that, like backing that up, was um on page two, and it said, "I'm going to rouse the whole SS and keep it so wide awake that we can tackle reconstruction in Germany immediately. Then Germanic work will be begun immediately in the general SS, for then the harvest will be ripe to be taken into granary." And yeah, that was my take on it. So
Okay. Yeah, I had pretty similar an understanding of it. I think one of the main points that I understood was that they wanted to just spread out the culture of Germany, and on the eastern territories that they would have newly occupied, they wanted to kind of instill the Nazi ideology upon the population and upon the culture of those new territories. I think one of the quotes that I had on page three was, "We shall be in position there to instruct every youth age group in the use of arms. We shall impose our laws on the East," which I think kind of perfectly highlights the fact that they just wanted to essentially just widespread their own culture upon their new territories that they're occupying. So,
Yeah, I mean, I had very similar stuff to you guys too. One of the other things that I caught was he wanted to spread not only the culture and like the colonization of Germany, but he also said he wanted to uh, expand the country of Germany itself. I think 5,000 kilometers eastward was the exact term that he used. One of the other things that he wanted to really hone in on was the increase of the Aryan population. One of the things that he kind of one of his keys was he said that he wanted reproduction to be another big priority of the German people in order to reach that goal of making the Aryan population like the majority of the human population. And on page one, I also found another quote that I thought was interesting that really kind of like highlighted how he really like how passionate he was about achieving these goals. And that quote was, "When somebody comes to me and says, I cannot dig this anti-tank ditch with women and children," speaking in terms of digging this tank ditch from women and children of other countries, "for it is inhumane, for it would kill them," then I would have to say you are a murderer of your own blood, because if the anti-tank ditch is not dug, German soldiers will die, and they are sons of German mothers. And I think that quote just perfectly highlights his feelings and his opinions on the whole situation.
yeah.
Okay, so are the films themselves more similar or different?
I feel like I found that they were more similar in like both of their uses of like propaganda techniques to like belittle certain like or particular groups of people, but I feel like they also had their differences. Like I feel like they weren't very like leaning towards like very similar, very different. But like in, I think it was the Eternal Jew like film, the Jews were like depicted as like subhuman and like dangerous, while in Know Your Enemy, like the Japanese were portrayed as like brutal and like inhumane almost. So that's how I feel like they were both very like they both use like highly like emotive like language and like images and music to almost like I don't know. For me, I felt like it was kind of like manipulating the audience's like emotions towards a certain group, that they also use those techniques. So I feel like they were very similar in that aspect. and how the Jew used like the Nazi propaganda films to seek to like justify like prosecution and like extermination of the Jews. And Know Your Enemy was like an American propaganda film almost made during the war to like demonize the Japanese. But I don't know, I just feel like they're very similar with their propaganda techniques, but yeah.
Yeah, I thought that they were both similar and different in various ways. I think both of them obviously are kind of tackling an issue of what they seem to be the enemy or the opposition. And they're obviously talking about both selective groups in negative ways. I thought that the Eternal Jew was fairly much more like hateful and derogatory towards the Jewish people compared to the US propaganda film towards the Japanese people. I think that, especially towards the beginning of the US film, that it was more informational and they were strictly just trying to understand as a whole the like Japanese people, and there was the occasional like derogatory explanations of who they are and what they do, and especially many things about the emperor that they talked about. But I think that as a whole, there was many cases where it just went on and on and on about talking about like the Jews, comparing them to rats, and that they faked being poor to avoid taxes. What else did I have down? That they're like not productive workers. Whereas I think there are elements of the US film that actually kind of gave the Japanese a benefit of the doubt and highlighted some aspects where they're not completely terrible human beings. And then, but I think they are obviously similar because they are enemies of the propaganda people that are making the film.
Yeah, I agree in the sense that it's definitely in terms of like similar differences, like they both have plenty of each, but I personally went on the side of that they're more different. Um, Really the main reason is like because at the core of both films, like the countries that made them, they were both aiming to weaponize their people against another group of people, right? And they just went about it in completely different ways. Like
Mhm.
Isaac was saying, like the Nazi films, it had no like logical like evidence or kind of foundation to it. It had no like basis behind it. It was just straight insults and just using derogatory and stereotypical features of Jewish people and their economic standpoints, where their positions in the world, and they use that against them. And like he was saying, like they even compared them to rats at one point. And even at the end of the film, they spent maybe, I think it was like the last 20 minutes or so, just highlighting Jews from all around the world that are in different, places of power. And almost as if to say is like, like, how do you think they got there? Like, it's because they're evil, kind of expecting the viewers to make that kind of connection. Whereas like in the US film, yes, they did obviously, for lack of a better term, they did really use a bit more of a logical standpoint. Like first they described like the history of Japan. They also they discussed I think it was Shintoism was the name of the religion. They discussed that for a while. And it was almost as if they wanted to understand, like Isaac was saying, like why they are the way that they are and how they got there. And that kind of goes back to the name, like know your enemy. So I think, while they are very similar and very different ways, I think I would err on the side of more different.
Yeah, no, I agree with that too, because I feel like they were both obviously propaganda type films, but I almost feel like similar to what you were saying, the Japanese film was more almost informational at points, where the Eternal Jew one was just more like almost racist and derogatory the whole time. Because I
Right.
think in the Japanese one too, I was kind of interested when it started. It was talking about like the height they have to be and like weights and stuff and things they eat, which I thought was like an interesting way to start the film, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that the strict comparison of like hateful versus informational was the best kind of way that I can compare the two films,
Mhm.
because in the US film they're obviously at war and they're not, trying to put the Japanese in a good light, but it's important to understand the enemy in light of the title of the movie. And
Mhm.
I think that strictly understanding their motivation, the Japanese people, of, who they are and what they strive to do, when they continuously explain that all the Japanese people are really just dedicating their entire work of life to accomplishing the goal of the emperor and like spreading out and conquering the world essentially. That I think does more light or gives more light to the mission of the Japanese people compared to just saying that Jewish people are evil and not really having much backing behind it. So I think understanding an element of a mission or an element of a motivation or initiative is much more, it does much more effect than that of the Nazi film.
It's a really good point, actually. I didn't really think about that because, like I said, they do have similar goals, but at the same time, not really similar. Like you said, the U.S. was at war, and their end goal, their end all be all, was just to defeat the Japanese and then return to their way of life, and then allow the Japanese to return to their way of life. Whereas the Nazi goal was to just eradicate the Jews entirely and completely wipe them off the face of the earth, and that definitely kind of feeds into why they used the tactics that they did too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this
Yeah.
was something like small that I noticed. Like it's I don't know if this is something I noticed, and I could be wrong, but the Eternal Jew film was from 1940, I think. And I feel like that was before like I think it was called like The Final Solution was fully like implemented. So I feel like the Jewish, like the Eternal Jew film was aimed at like increasing anti-Semitic like sentiment among German people, and the Know Your Enemy Japanese film was made in 1945, which I think was kind of like the final stages of World War II. So it was aimed at almost like rallying support for like American war, like efforts against Japan. But I don't know. That was just something I noticed. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one last point that I had was in the American film, they touched upon the fact that Japanese students, from the point that they're beginning to be educated, have that main goal of the emperor instilled upon them. And so I think it helps the audience that the film is trying to reach understand the mind set and the perspective of the Japanese person, where all that they've been told, like the main thing that they've been told continuously over and over and over again in regards to repetition, is the emperor's goal and the fact that you should strive to contribute to this as best as you can. So I think understanding that and understanding how that affects like the perseverance of all Japanese people and why they are kind of the way they are.
Mhm.
Okay, so would you classify either film as secular millenarian?
I said I would classify the Eternal Jew film as secular, millenarianism, whatever. I can't even say it. I said it for that one, but not the Japanese film, I think. Yeah. Because I felt the Eternal Jew one just like almost subscribed to just like the whole ideology of like the Nazi ideology, and like it draws a very clear line of who is good and who is evil in the film, or like what the film is saying. And it almost foresees like the utopia that like once like the Jews are like dead or converted, that like that's what they want. So that's why I felt that film was more secular millenarianism. And like I think it also like was talking about like religion, like Judaism, and as that's like a rival for believers. But I just felt the Know Your Enemy, the Japanese one, didn't like fit, or at least the like criteria that it gave for the on I think it was like the keywords definition for secular whatever. But I just felt it didn't like subscribe to that clear like ideology as well. And like I'm trying to see what I had in my notes, but I would just classify that one, like the Jewish one, more as secular, millenarianism, whatever.
Yeah, I would agree, definitely. I think that when I looked over the secular millenarianism definition in the key terms, the key aspect that I drew from it was the comparison and the battle of good versus evil and
Yeah.
good prevailing, and then that allows the utopian society to kind of begin. So, in regards to the Eternal Jew, if you're viewing it strictly from a Nazi perspective, which is the audience of the film, they consider themselves to be the good in this case, and they consider the Jewish people to be the evil. And the objective, the main objective of this, is to instill a hateful mindset towards the quote unquote evil in the eyes of the Nazis. And in their mind, they hope that they would prevail. And in that case, their utopian society would begin, because then they're able to kind of get rid of the evil in their minds.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, you guys pretty much hit the nail on the head. In terms of the Eternal Jew, I mean, it pretty much checks off every box that would be necessary for something to be considered secular millenarianism. The clearly defined ideology, I guess you can consider that Hitler's Mein Kampf book. The clear line between good and evil, like you were saying, Isaac, is if you are viewing it from their standpoint, they're obviously the good guys and the Jews are the bad guys, or anyone who isn't of Aryan blood or would be considered the bad guys. The foreseeing a utopia once the evil's defeated. One of the things that Hitler preached throughout his time as the leader of Germany was his thousand-year Reich, which would come into place once the wars ended and all the Jews are eradicated. So that checks off that box. The only thing that I guess you could really object to it being secular millenarianism would be regarding religion as a rival for believers. Because I believe at least in the beginning, when the Nazi party was still gaining traction, one of their kind of talking points was they wanted to create a kind of like pure Christianity kind of thing, but it only would be involved, or only those who are of Aryan blood would be allowed to partake in that. And that kind of works against the idea of secular millenarianism for the Eternal Jew film. But I think other than that, it definitely hits every mark. In terms of the U.S. film, I agree. I don't think that's secular millenarian like at all. There really is. I mean, I guess you can consider the Americans to be the good guys and the Japanese to be the bad guys, but it's not like a deep seated hatred like the Germans had for the Jews kind of thing.
Mhm.
Also with the religion aspect, you know, that one of the founding principles our country was built upon was the freedom of religion, so that definitely works against it too. But other than that, I think you guys definitely covered everything.
Yeah, those are good points.
Sorry, I lost it. One. Okay, so compare the cartoons to the films.
Okay. I'm kind of all over the place with this, honestly, but I feel like all three of them do have like the like similarity with their uses of like propaganda, and obviously the US film wasn't as like big with this, but there was like some aspects of like dehumanization. So I felt like all three of them were very similar in that aspect, and they all kind of like can depict an enemy as like subhuman or like unworthy. But like I think the cartoons, I didn't focus on like one specifically. I kind of compared just like all of them to it, but the cartoons were similar, like with the aspect of the Eternal Jew movie. I feel like they compared more with that because they were like pretty racist and derogatory. But in some of the cartoons, it was like they were depicting Japanese soldiers almost like monkey-like creatures, and they had very like like exaggerated facial features, which was obviously pretty racist. And the Eternal Jew movie, like as we were saying before, they were portraying Jews as like rats and all of this stuff. But yeah, I couldn't really find much of an example in the US film about like Japan. I feel like it kind of could describe the Japanese as like um just like describing who they are for war aspects, like sneaky and stuff like that. But I didn't find that it was as like dehumanizing in the film. But I feel like they also had their differences where like the cartoons focused specifically on, I think it was like the Pacific War and just like racial attitudes that would fuel it, whereas the films had like different goals, like know your enemy was more to like educate soldiers about their enemy, while Eternal Jew was like explicitly like anti-Semitic like propaganda. But yeah, that's pretty much sums up what I had about it.
Yeah, the way that I thought about it was it's almost kind of a three-way Venn diagram.
Mm.
So with the cartoons, obviously they're talking very derogatory ways about the Japanese people, like you said, comparing them to monkeys and very other, racist things. That I think I made an extreme comparison to the derogatory ways that the Nazis referred to the Jews. So I think that the cartoons and the Eternal Jew connect in that way. I think that the cartoons and knowing your enemy is connected in regards to like the actual subject material. I think the focus of the cartoons were strictly upon the war between the US and Japan. There wasn't necessarily much of a focus on the Nazis' views on Jews, for example. So I think subject material, those were connected. But overall, the focus was on kind of derogatory terms towards Japanese. So I think that it drew aspects from the hatefulness of the Eternal Jew and the actual subject matter from the USA film.
Yeah, so the first comparisons I drew, I was comparing the cartoons to the Japanese film, and I kind of viewed them in like an inverse kind of way. So what I mean by that is the cartoons, like you guys were saying, like the big kind of the big piece that drew people in was the exaggerated cartoonish features and the obviously racist implications that those were creating. But they also at the same time did have a bit of an informative piece. I don't remember exactly which, but one of the cartoons was saying like, you see how the Japanese treated us at Pearl Harbor. We need to do the same thing. We need to come at them hard and fast and quickly if we want to end this war. And so like the cartoons had the big, the big racist piece and the very little informative piece. And I thought the movie was kind of the inverse of that, whereas it did have bits and pieces of racist commentary in it, but it also was extremely informative. Like I was saying earlier with the history of their religion and just the history of the country as a whole. And then when comparing the cartoons to the Nazi film, we have the pretty obvious connections of the stereotypical physical features that are overly exaggerated. So I thought it was much harder to find comparisons between the Japanese cartoons and the Japanese film, just because of, like I said, how the informative pieces were completely different, but they were also similar in a way.
Yeah, I completely agree. I just feel like the US film and the cartoons were like the same in the aspect of the context they were about, but like the Jewish film and the cartoons were the same in their aspects of like racial and derogatory context almost. But yeah.
All right. So any other thoughts?
Not
I
that I
don't
had.
know.
I don't think I do either.
Okay. We'll end it.